I was the light that appeared in the eastern sky, and for many nights I hung there, unmoving to every eye but the one searching for me. I did not choose the hour of my appearing, nor the men who would lift their heads to notice me among 10,000 ordinary stars. I only know that on the night I began to shine differently. Something ancient stirred in the hearts of men who had spent their lives reading the heavens like a language older than any nation. They were far away in the lands east of Judea, scholars of the sky, men who charted the slow wandering of planets and believed the stars whispered of kings and kingdoms. I do not know exactly how many of them set out from their homes that night, nor precisely how long their journey took, for Scripture does not tell us these things, and I will not pretend to know what has not been revealed. What I do know is this: they saw me, and they believed I meant something no ordinary light could mean. They believed a king had been born, and so they left everything familiar behind, their comforts, their certainties, their understanding of how the world worked, to follow a light across a desert toward a country they had never seen. I want to tell you what I witnessed. Not a legend, not an embellishment, only what the Gospel of Matthew records and what I, if I could speak, would confirm with a trembling kind of reverence. Because before I was a symbol in a story, I was placed in the sky by the same hand that formed every star before me, and I was given one particular task: to mark the birth of a child who would change everything. But my part in this story was not simple. It was not just about the night I led them to Bethlehem. There was a return journey too, a moment far quieter, but every bit as meaningful. And by the end of what I have to tell you, you may find yourself wondering how much of your own life has been guided by a light you almost didn't notice. To understand why my appearing meant so much, you have to understand the world these travelers came from. Most Bible scholars identify them as magi, a term used in the ancient world for a class of learned men from regions such as Persia or Babylon, priestly scholars trained in astrology, astronomy, and the interpretation of dreams and omens. Matthew's Gospel does not tell us their number, their names, or even that there were exactly three of them. That familiar image comes from later church tradition, inspired by the three gifts they carried, not from the biblical text itself. What Scripture tells us plainly is that they came from the east, that they saw a star, and that they came searching for a king. This detail matters more than it might first appear. In the ancient world, the movement of the heavens was not considered background noise. Many Near Eastern cultures believed the stars declared the rise and fall of nations, the birth of great rulers, the turning of history itself. So when a new light appeared unlike any known pattern, men trained to watch the sky for exactly this kind of sign would have taken it seriously. Historians note that several astronomical theories have been proposed over the centuries to explain what might have caused such a sign: a conjunction of planets, a comet, a nova, though Scripture does not specify which, if any, of these matches what these men saw. What matters for the story is not the explanation science might offer, but the response of faith it produced. Whatever I was, in whatever form I first appeared to them, they trusted that I meant something worth crossing a wilderness to find. Judea itself, at this time, sat under the uneasy rule of King Herod the Great, a man remembered by history as both a builder of remarkable grandeur and a ruler consumed by fear of losing his throne. Herod had been installed by Rome, and though he expanded the temple in Jerusalem into one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world, he was also known for eliminating anyone he perceived as a threat to his power, including members of his own family. This is the political climate into which the Magi arrived, not innocently wandering into a peaceful land, but stepping into the court of a paranoid king, who would soon hear troubling news about a rival born under his own nose. Bethlehem itself was a small town, unremarkable in the eyes of the world, yet the prophet Micah had spoken centuries earlier that from Bethlehem would come one who would shepherd God's people. This was not an obscure detail buried in scrolls no one read. When Herod later asked his religious scholars where the Messiah was to be born, they answered immediately, citing this very prophecy. The location was not a mystery to those who studied the Scriptures. What was mysterious was the timing, the manner, and above all, the child himself. For who among Jerusalem's religious leaders expected the promised king to be born not in a palace, but in the humble surroundings later described in Luke's Gospel? This is the world the Magi entered, a calculated, tense, politically dangerous land, ruled by a king who trusted no one, watched over by religious leaders who studied prophecy without recognizing the moment it was being fulfilled around them. And into that world from far away came a handful of travelers led by nothing but the conviction that a star meant a king had been born, and a willingness to follow it wherever it led. Consider, too, what such a journey would have demanded of them physically. Whether they came from Babylon, Persia, or the broader regions historians associate with the term the East, the distance involved would have stretched hundreds of miles across difficult terrain, open desert, rocky hill country, unfamiliar roads with no guarantee of safety. Caravans of that era moved slowly, often no faster than the pace of the animals carrying their supplies, and a journey of this length could easily have taken weeks, possibly longer. Scripture does not give us a precise timetable, and any specific number of days offered by later tradition should be understood as historical estimation rather than biblical fact. What we can say with confidence is that this was not a brief errand. It was a costly, deliberate pilgrimage undertaken by men who had every reason to stay home in comfort, and every reason to doubt whether a distant light was worth risking their safety to follow. It is worth pausing, as well, on the spiritual isolation these men would have felt long before they ever reached Jerusalem. They were not part of the community that had waited generations for a promised Messiah. They had no access to the synagogue teachings, no elders reciting the words of Isaiah or Micah around them since childhood. Whatever conviction stirred in their hearts came from outside the covenant entirely, from watching the sky with the tools available to them, and choosing to trust that the God who set the stars in place was still speaking through them. In this sense, their journey stands as one of the earliest recorded pictures in the New Testament of what it looks like for those outside Israel to be drawn toward the hope that Israel's own prophets had long foretold. But that was only the beginning. I remember the moment I first noticed them noticing me. There is a particular kind of attention a person gives to something they believe holds meaning, and I felt that attention long before their caravan ever crossed into Judea. According to Matthew's account, when they arrived in Jerusalem, they did not go quietly. They asked openly, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Imagine the weight of those words landing in a city ruled by a jealous king. Matthew tells us plainly that when Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Herod called together the chief priests and teachers of the law and demanded to know where the Messiah was to be born. They answered him from the prophet Micah, in Bethlehem, in the land of Judah. Herod then called the Magi to him secretly, wanting to learn the exact time I had first appeared to them. There is something deeply unsettling in this moment, something Scripture does not need to embellish for us to feel its weight. A king trembling before the idea of a child. Scholars trembling before a prophecy they could recite, but did not yet understand. Herod sent the travelers on to Bethlehem with instructions to find the child and report back to him, claiming he too wished to worship him. Though Matthew makes clear this was a deception, for Herod's true intention was to eliminate any threat to his throne. It is a sobering contrast. Men from a foreign land, outsiders to the covenant, responding to the news of a king with reverence and worship, while the ruler who sat on Judah's very throne responded with fear and calculated violence. Bethlehem itself lay only a short distance from Jerusalem, close enough that the travelers could have covered the remaining stretch in a matter of hours rather than days. Yet that short remaining distance must have felt weighted with uncertainty. They had just left the presence of a king whose intentions, though hidden behind polite words, carried an unmistakable undertone of danger. They had heard the prophecy recited by Jerusalem's own scholars, confirming that Bethlehem was indeed the place. And now they were walking the final stretch of a journey that had, by this point, likely spanned weeks or months, toward a town so small it barely registered on the maps of the empire that ruled it. After leaving Herod's presence, the travelers continued on toward Bethlehem, and it is here that I return most vividly to my place in the story. Matthew records that the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, Scripture says they were overjoyed with exceedingly great joy. I want you to sit with that description for a moment. Not simply pleased, not simply relieved after a long journey. Overjoyed, a phrase Matthew uses with unusual intensity, as though ordinary language could not carry what they felt in that moment. I do not know how I appeared to move, nor can I explain in scientific terms what it meant to stop over a particular place, and Scripture does not offer that explanation either. I only know that these men, exhausted from travel, burdened by their encounter with a fearful king, were given in that instant a confirmation their hearts had been longing for since the night they first left home. The light that had called them out had not abandoned them partway through the journey. It had led them all the way to the very place where the child lay. Matthew tells us they entered the house, not a stable, as popular imagination often pictures by this point in the timeline, but a house, suggesting some time had passed since the child's birth in Bethlehem, and the family had since settled somewhere more permanent within the town. There they saw the child with his mother Mary, and Scripture says simply that they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Each of these gifts has long been understood by Christian tradition to carry meaning beyond mere material value. Gold, historically associated with royalty, honoring a king. Frankincense, a fragrant resin used in worship, honoring a priest. Myrrh, an embalming spice, foreshadowing the suffering and death this child would one day endure for the sake of others. Scripture does not explicitly interpret the gifts this way within the text itself, and it is worth being honest about that distinction. This symbolic understanding comes from centuries of Christian reflection rather than a direct statement in Matthew's Gospel. But even without assigning deeper meaning to each item, the gifts themselves testify to something remarkable. Foreign scholars, unfamiliar with the covenant given to Israel, recognized in this child something worth their most valuable possessions. Think about what it must have looked like from the doorway of that ordinary house. A young mother, likely still adjusting to the weight of all she had already carried. The angel's visit, the long journey to Bethlehem for the census, the humble birth Luke describes in such plain terms. And then, without warning, a company of foreign travelers arriving at her door, dressed in the manner of distant lands, bowing before her child as though he were the ruler of an empire. There is no record of what Mary said in that moment, and Scripture wisely does not invent words for her. But Luke tells us elsewhere that she treasured such things and pondered them in her heart, and it is not difficult to imagine this moment joining that same quiet treasury of wonder. What happened next revealed something remarkable about how God continued to guard this child even after the visit was complete. Matthew tells us that the Magi, having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, went back to their own country by another route. This is the part of the story that brings me back to the title you may have come here wondering about, the light that guided the wise men home. I want to be careful here, because I cannot claim to have witnessed a dream. Dreams are private, unseen even by the stars above the room where a person sleeps. Scripture does not tell us that I personally led them home the way I had led them to Bethlehem. What Scripture tells us is that God warned them directly, through a dream, and they obeyed, choosing a different path than the one Herod expected, protecting not only themselves but, in effect, protecting the child they had just left behind. And yet, in a broader sense, I have come to understand something about my part in this story that stretches beyond the physical light I gave off in the night sky. The same God who placed me in the heavens to mark a birth was the same God who spoke into a dream to mark a departure. The guidance did not stop when their eyes stopped seeing me. It simply changed form from light in the sky to a voice in the stillness of sleep. Perhaps that is a truth worth carrying with you, that the guidance of God does not always look the same from one season to the next, yet it comes from the same faithful source, whether we can see it shining above us or only sense it whispering within us. Yet the most important moment had not yet come, not in the physical events of the story, but in what this all means for those who hear it centuries later. Matthew's account continues by telling us that after the Magi departed, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, warning him to take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, for Herod was about to search for the child to destroy him. Herod, realizing he had been outwitted by the Magi, gave orders to kill every boy in Bethlehem 2 years old and under, based on the time he had learned from the travelers. This tragic detail, sometimes called the Massacre of the Innocents, stands as a sobering reminder of the cost that often surrounds the arrival of hope in a broken world. It is not a detail to dwell on with sensational language, but it is part of the biblical record, and it reflects the desperate lengths earthly power will go to protect itself against the humble arrival of God's purposes. Through it all, the child was protected, the family fled, the travelers went home a different way, and I remained in the sky, having played my small part in a much larger unfolding of God's plan, a plan that had been prophesied for generations, hidden in plain sight within Scripture, waiting for the appointed time to be revealed. So what does this story mean for those of us watching from thousands of years later, with no star hanging visibly in our own sky, no obvious sign pointing us toward Bethlehem? I think the first thing this story teaches is that God speaks in ways that meet people where they are. The Magi were not part of the covenant people of Israel. They did not have access to the prophets, the priests, or the temple. What they had was their training in the stars, and God used exactly that language to draw them toward his Son. This does not mean God endorses every practice of ancient astrology, but it does reveal something beautiful about his character. He is willing to reach people through the very things they already understand, drawing them gently toward a truth greater than anything they first expected to find. The second lesson is about the nature of true worship contrasted with false devotion. Herod claimed he wished to worship the child, yet his heart was set on destruction. The Magi, foreigners with no obligation to this Jewish king, traveled great distances and gave sacrificially, asking nothing in return except the joy of seeing him with their own eyes. Real worship costs something. It is not measured by how loudly someone declares their devotion, but by what they are willing to surrender in pursuit of it, their comfort, their wealth, their sense of control over their own plans. There is also a quieter lesson in the way the light guided them only one step at a time. I did not reveal to them the entire journey in a single moment. I appeared first as a sign that stirred their hearts to begin. I appeared next as confirmation once they had already committed to Bethlehem. And then, in the final movement of the story, guidance came not through me at all, but through a dream given directly by God. This mirrors something true about how faith often works in a person's life. We rarely receive the whole map at once. We are given enough light for the step in front of us, and as we walk faithfully into that light, more is revealed when the time is right. This story also speaks powerfully to the theme of God's providence, extending even into the plans of frightened, powerful men. Herod's scheming did not catch God by surprise. The warning dreams given to both the Magi and to Joseph demonstrate a God who is intimately involved in protecting his purposes, even amid violent opposition. For anyone who has ever felt that the powers around them are too strong, too clever, or too determined to be overcome, this account offers a quiet but firm reassurance. No earthly throne, however fortified, can overturn what God has ordained. And finally, there is the matter of joy, that word Matthew chose so deliberately to describe the Magi's reaction upon seeing the star again above the house in Bethlehem. Exceedingly great joy. Not simply satisfaction at completing a difficult journey, but overwhelming joy at recognizing that the light they had trusted had not failed them. I think many people today are searching for exactly this kind of confirmation, some sign that the faith they have stepped out on, often at great personal cost, has not been misplaced. The story of the Magi tells us that when we follow the light we are given, however small it may seem, however far it may lead us from home, it can bring us to a moment of worship so full that ordinary words struggle to describe it. There is one more dimension of this story worth sitting with, the way it speaks to the tension between certainty and trust. The Magi did not have absolute proof, in the way we often demand proof today, that the star they followed truly signified the birth of a king. They had conviction, born from years of studying the sky, and they had enough courage to act on that conviction before they had any confirmation at all. It was only after the long journey, after standing before Herod, after walking the final road to Bethlehem, that they received the confirmation of seeing me again above the house. Faith, in this story, precedes certainty. The traveling comes before the joy. This is perhaps one of the most honest pictures of faith found anywhere in Scripture, not a demand for proof before movement, but a willingness to move because something within them recognized truth before their eyes could fully confirm it. It is also worth noting how this account gently corrects any temptation to measure someone's nearness to God by their outward status or background. The chief priests and teachers of the law in Jerusalem knew the prophecy by memory. They could recite exactly where the Messiah was to be born, yet none of them made the short journey to Bethlehem to see for themselves. It was the outsiders, men with no covenant claim, no inherited promise, no scriptural upbringing, who took the prophecy seriously enough to act on it. Knowledge alone did not bring the priests to worship. It was the willingness to respond to what one already believed that brought the Magi all the way from their homeland to a small house in Judea. If you find yourself in a season where the path forward feels uncertain, where you are not sure whether the light you started following was ever real to begin with, take heart in what these travelers discovered. The child they came to worship was not diminished by being found in a modest house rather than a palace. He was not any less a king for having been born in humble circumstances. Sometimes the very things that make us hesitate, the smallness of the beginning, the ordinariness of the setting, are exactly the places where God chooses to reveal his greatest work. As I look back across all these centuries, from that quiet corner of the night sky where I first began to shine differently, I think often about how brief my role in this story truly was. A single sign, one movement across the heavens, given for the sake of a handful of travelers who had the courage to trust it. And yet that brief moment became part of a story that has been told and retold for 2,000 years, carrying hope to people who never saw me directly but who have found their own lights to follow, a word of scripture, a quiet conviction, a moment of unexpected peace in the middle of fear. I was only the light. I did not choose the child, nor did I write the prophecy that foretold his birth, nor did I calm the fear in Joseph's heart when the angel spoke to him in the night. I simply did what I was placed there to do, shine long enough, clearly enough, for those who were watching for something greater than themselves to find their way. Perhaps that is the quiet invitation hidden within this ancient account. You may not see a star hanging visibly over your own life, pointing toward an obvious destination. But the same God who guided foreign travelers across a desert, who warned a family in a dream, who protected a child from a jealous king, is still in the business of guiding those who are willing to watch, to wonder, and to follow even when the path is only revealed one step at a time. The Magi eventually faded from the biblical record, their names unknown, their homeland only vaguely described, their final days left entirely to history rather than scripture. But what they left behind was a testimony that has outlasted every empire of their age, that when God sends a sign, however unfamiliar its form, those who follow it in faith will find themselves overjoyed at the destination, and quietly, faithfully guided, even on the journey home. I think of Herod's palace now, long since reduced to ruins scattered across the Judean hills, Its grandeur crumbled into the same dust as every other kingdom built on fear rather than faith. And I think of that small house in Bethlehem, so unremarkable that no one thought to mark its location for the history books, and yet it held within its walls the very thing every empire before or since has failed to produce, a king whose reign would never end. There is something fitting in that contrast. The powerful fortress became rubble. The humble house became the center of a story still told 2,000 years later, in languages and lands the Magi themselves never could have imagined, carried by a child born far from any palace, wrapped not in royal linen, but in the plain cloths of an ordinary family doing their best in difficult circumstances. I have shown over many things across the ages, though none so significant as that single night above Bethlehem. But if my brief appearance in Scripture can offer one lasting comfort to those who hear this story now, let it be this. The same God who guided distant strangers across an unfamiliar wilderness is not a distant God to you either. He speaks through what you already understand, meets you in whatever season of searching you find yourself in, and remains faithful to complete the guidance he begins. Whether that guidance comes as a bright and undeniable sign, or as a quiet dream in the stillness of the night, or as a small and steady conviction that simply will not let you go. Perhaps you have never seen anything as clear as a star pointing toward your next step. Perhaps your own journey has felt more like Joseph's, waiting in the dark for a whispered warning, trusting a voice you cannot fully explain to those around you. Both forms of guidance came from the same source. Both led to the same preserved and protected purpose. And both remind us that God's care for his people has never depended on how dramatic the sign appears, but on the faithfulness of the one who sends it. So if you find yourself watching for a sign tonight, do not be discouraged if it does not look the way you expected. Sometimes the light that leads us home is quieter than the one that first called us out. Sometimes it comes as peace instead of proof, as a settled heart instead of a blazing sky. But it comes from the same faithful hand, and it is worth trusting all the same. If this story strengthened your faith or helped you see Scripture from a fresh perspective, consider subscribing to Faith Cognition for more original Bible storytelling.